22 June 1941. At dawn, 3 million German soldiers surge across a 1,800-mile front, the rumble of 3,500 tanks and 2,700 aircraft tearing through the quiet of the Soviet borderlands. Operation Barbarossa, Hitler's gamble to destroy the Soviet Union in a single campaign, is underway. For a brief moment, it looks unstoppable. Soviet defenses collapse, entire armies are encircled, and German commanders boast that the war in the East will be over by Christmas. Yet hidden inside this apparent triumph is the seed of catastrophe. In less than 4 years, those same forces will be shattered, retreating all the way back to Berlin. What went so catastrophically wrong? In this video, we'll dissect the key strategic errors that doomed Barbarossa from the beginning. The faulty assumptions, ideological obsessions, logistical blindness, and fatal command decisions that turned a bold offensive into Germany's grave. Stay with this story, because every early victory carries the shadow of eventual defeat. To understand why Barbarossa shattered Germany, we have to move beyond cliches about Russian winter and Hitler's madness and look carefully at strategy. This wasn't just a big offensive that ran out of luck. It was a campaign built on flawed assumptions that guaranteed disaster once initial momentum faded. In the next 15 minutes, we'll walk through the invasion step by step, from planning tables in Berlin to the snows outside Moscow, highlighting how key decisions created a chain reaction Germany could never reverse. If you enjoy deep dives into military history and the hard lessons of strategy, you're in the right place. Consider subscribing and tapping the notification bell so you don't miss upcoming episodes on other decisive campaigns. And try to watch through to the end. The final takeaways will connect Barbarossa's failures to broader principles of planning, intelligence, and overreach that still matter in modern conflicts and even in non-military strategy today. Barbarossa was born in fantasy as much as in planning. Hitler and many in the Nazi leadership believed the Soviet Union was a colossus with feet of clay, a fragile, backward state that would collapse at the first hard blow. They grossly underestimated Soviet industrial capacity, the depth of its manpower reserves, and the regime's willingness to accept staggering losses. This ideological contempt fused with a dangerous optimism. German successes in Poland and France convinced Hitler that blitzkrieg was a universal formula. He assumed that one rapid campaign could knock out the Soviets before they fully mobilized, eliminating any need to prepare for a prolonged war of attrition. The result was a strategic objective that was both enormous and vague: destroy the Red Army, seize key cities, and topple the Soviet state within a few months. No serious contingency planning existed for failure. From day one, Barbarossa was structured as a sprint in a theater that demanded a marathon, and that mismatch framed every later mistake. German intelligence before Barbarossa was shockingly poor for an operation of such scale. The Wehrmacht underestimated Soviet troop numbers by millions and badly misjudged the depth of Soviet reserves. They assumed the Red Army fielded around 150 divisions. In reality, the Soviets could mobilize far more, replenishing destroyed units with shocking speed. Equally grave was the underestimation of Soviet industry. German planners believed that conquering the Western USSR would knock out most of Soviet production. They failed to anticipate that entire factories, thousands of them, could be dismantled and moved east of the Urals, beyond the reach of German bombers, and restarted within months. Intelligence on infrastructure was also weak. Road networks, rail capacity, and the sheer difficulty of the terrain were not fully understood. This wasn't just a matter of missing data. It reflected a bias. Information that contradicted Hitler's hopes was filtered, softened, or ignored. Faulty intelligence reinforced faulty assumptions, creating a strategic echo chamber in Berlin. From the outset, Barbarossa suffered from unclear and competing objectives. Rather than a single concentrated thrust, Hitler divided his forces into 3 massive army groups: north toward Leningrad, center toward Moscow and south toward Ukraine and the Caucasus. Each had its own priorities, and fuel, supplies, and reserves had to be split between them. German generals, especially Halder, and many on the general staff believed the main objective should be Moscow, the political, economic, and rail hub of the Soviet Union. Hitler, however, oscillated. He saw Leningrad as symbolically vital and Ukraine as an agricultural and resource prize. This led to constant arguments and mid-campaign changes of direction. Instead of focusing overwhelming force on a decisive point, Barbarossa tried to do everything at once: destroy the Red Army in the field, capture key cities, secure resources, and cut off Soviet retreat. The result was strategic dilution. Each army group advanced impressively, but nowhere was force applied with enough sustained concentration to break the Soviet state. Tanks and aircraft win battles. Fuel, food, and spare parts win campaigns. Barbarossa's logistics were never designed for a prolonged drive deep into the Soviet interior. German supply planning assumed a short war. Stockpiles were limited and there was no robust plan to maintain fully supplied armies hundreds of miles beyond their railheads. Railways became a nightmare. The Soviet Union used a different track gauge, so German engineers had to convert thousands of kilometers of rail while the army advanced. Meanwhile, roads were primitive, especially in bad weather. Trucks broke down, horses exhausted, and fuel had to travel over ever longer distances. As panzer spearheads raced ahead, their supply lines stretched thin. Infantry and logistics units lagged days behind. Ammunition shortages, fuel rationing, and lack of winter clothing weren't just unfortunate problems. They were structural consequences of a strategy that treated logistics as an afterthought. By autumn, German forces were tactically brilliant but increasingly operationally paralyzed. German early victories were stunning. Minsk, Smolensk, Uman, Kiev, names that became synonymous with vast Soviet encirclements. Hundreds of thousands of Red Army soldiers were captured, entire fronts disintegrated. Many German commanders believed these were war-ending blows. Yet success hid a deeper problem. Each encirclement consumed time, fuel, and effort, while pushing German forces farther into the Soviet interior. The Red Army was bleeding but not collapsing. Soviet command ruthlessly raised new formations, shuffled surviving units, and shifted industry east. For every pocket destroyed, more forces appeared. Crucially, these victories reinforced Hitler's belief that his assumptions were correct, discouraging any rethink of objectives or logistics. The Wehrmacht was winning tactically but not strategically. Instead of focusing on a single crushing thrust, German forces became trapped in a cycle: advance, encircle, exhaust, pause, and repeat, all while the calendar crept toward autumn and Soviet resilience hardened rather than broke. Nowhere were strategic divisions clearer than in the debate over Moscow. By late summer 1941, Army Group Center stood within striking distance of the Soviet capital. Many German generals argued that capturing Moscow could disrupt Soviet command, rail networks, and morale decisively. Hitler, however, redirected key panzer groups south to encircle Soviet forces around Kiev and secure Ukraine. The Kiev operation was a massive tactical success, over 500,000 Soviet prisoners, but it cost precious weeks. When the drive on Moscow, Operation Typhoon, finally began in October, the weather was turning, Soviet defenses were stiffening, and the Germans were already worn down. This delay was not just about lost time, it was about momentum and balance. By trying to secure both Ukraine and Moscow in sequence, Hitler sacrificed the chance for a concentrated, timely blow at the Soviet center. The very scale of the Kiev victory concealed its strategic price. It helped ensure that the later assault on Moscow would fall just short. Barbarossa was never just a military operation. It was an ideological crusade. Nazi racial doctrine portrayed Slavs as subhuman and Bolshevism as a mortal enemy to be exterminated. This belief shaped strategic behavior in ways that actively undermined German goals. Instead of trying to fracture the Soviet Union by exploiting local grievances among Ukrainians, Balts, or anti-Stalinist Russians, German occupation policies were brutal. Mass shootings, starvation policies, and the war of annihilation against Jews and perceived undesirables drove populations into the arms of the Soviet regime. Potential allies became enemies. On the military side, Hitler's insistence on no retreat orders, driven partly by ideological refusal to concede ground, led to unnecessary encirclements of German forces later in the war. The initial campaign baked in this mentality. Destroying the Jewish Bolshevik enemy took precedence over flexible, rational strategy. Ideology narrowed German options, stiffened Soviet resolve, and made any negotiated outcome or internal Soviet collapse far less likely. The Red Army in 1941 was battered, often poorly led, and reeling from Stalin's purges, yet it adapted with brutal speed. Soviet commanders learned from disaster, experimenting with defense in depth, counterattacks, and, crucially, time-buying strategies. They traded space for time, retreating while inflicting attrition and drawing German forces deeper. Behind the lines, the Soviet state mobilized on a scale Germany couldn't match. Entire factories moved east by rail, rebuilt under primitive conditions, and resumed production of T-34 tanks, artillery, and aircraft. Conscription filled new units even as older ones were destroyed. Stalin's regime used terror, nationalism, and appeals to the Great Patriotic War to harden resistance. By autumn, German commanders noticed something unsettling. Every time they destroyed a Soviet formation, another appeared. The assumption that the USSR would collapse after losing its western territories proved false. The Soviet Union was behaving not like a brittle empire, but like a wounded, mobilizing superpower, willing to absorb unimaginable losses to stay in the fight. As autumn rains arrived, the German advance slowed dramatically. Roads dissolved into mud in the infamous Rasputitsa, vehicles sank axle-deep, horses struggled, supply trucks stalled. This seasonal reality had been well known to locals but largely dismissed in German planning. When the ground finally froze, the push toward Moscow resumed, but at a terrible cost. German troops lacked adequate winter clothing, lubricants congealed, weapons malfunctioned in extreme cold, frostbite casualties mounted, and supply lines already overstretched could not deliver enough food, fuel, or ammunition. It's tempting to blame General Winter alone, but climate was the amplifier, not the root cause. Poor logistics, overextension, and delayed decision-making turned weather into a strategic disaster. The Soviets, by contrast, fought on familiar ground, with shorter internal lines and fresh Siberian divisions redeployed after intelligence indicated Japan would not attack the USSR. Winter punished both sides, but only one had planned a campaign that assumed it would be finished before the snows. By December 1941, German spearheads could see the outskirts of Moscow, yet they were exhausted, understrength, and undersupplied. At this moment of maximum German vulnerability, the Soviets launched a massive counteroffensive, driving the Wehrmacht back from the capital. Hitler responded not with strategic flexibility, but with rigid command. He took direct control over military decisions, sacked generals who advocated operational withdrawals, and imposed stand-fast orders that forbade retreat even from tactically hopeless positions. Some local stands were heroic, many were needless bloodbaths. This command style, foreshadowed in Barbarossa's planning, now hardened into doctrine. Instead of trading space for time and preserving combat power, German forces were ordered to hold every inch. The immediate crisis outside Moscow passed, but the long-term damage was done. Germany lost the initiative and freedom of maneuver. Barbarossa's failure forced Hitler deeper into micromanagement and dogmatism, cementing patterns that would haunt every later campaign on the Eastern Front. By early 1942, Barbarossa's original vision, destroy the Soviet Union in one swift campaign, was dead. Germany now faced a prolonged war of attrition against an enemy with more manpower, growing industrial capacity, and vast strategic depth. The Eastern Front transformed into a grinding struggle that Germany was ill-equipped to win. The strategic errors of 1941 cascaded forward. Overextension and logistical weakness persisted. Ideological brutality intensified partisan warfare and solidified Soviet resolve. Split objectives and Hitler's interference continued, now focused on places like Stalingrad and the Caucasus. Germany had traded its pre-war advantages, initiative, operational surprise, concentration of force, for a war on terms chosen by its enemy. Barbarossa did more than fail. It trapped Nazi Germany in a conflict it could not escape or win. From this point onward, every German victory would be temporary, every offensive a gamble against worsening odds. The shattering of Barbarossa was the shattering of any realistic German path to victory in World War II. Stepping back, several key themes emerge from Barbarossa's failure. First, strategic arrogance. Hitler and his planners built their campaign on wishful thinking about Soviet weakness, ignoring contrary intelligence. Second, divided objectives. Splitting strength between Leningrad, Moscow, and Ukraine diluted Germany's ability to deliver a decisive blow at any one point. Third, logistical neglect. The greatest land invasion in history advanced without a sustainable supply system or serious planning for extended operations in harsh terrain and climate. Fourth, ideological blindness. Nazi racism and the War of Annihilation alienated potential allies and locked Germany into a fight to the death. Finally, rigid command. As setbacks mounted, Hitler's insistence on control and no-retreat orders sacrificed operational flexibility. Barbarossa teaches that even powerful militaries can engineer their own defeat when strategy is shaped more by ideology, ego, and short-term success than by realistic assessments of enemy resilience and one's own limitations. If you've stayed with this breakdown of Barbarossa's strategic errors, you've just traced how one of history's most ambitious offensives unraveled into catastrophe. Stories like this matter because they show how grand plans fail, not just through bad luck, but through flawed assumptions, ignored logistics, and leaders who can't adapt when reality bites back. If you'd like more in-depth explorations of campaigns, commanders, and turning points that reshaped history, consider subscribing to the channel and turning on the notification bell so you don't miss future episodes. In upcoming videos, we'll look at Stalingrad, the North African theater, and the Pacific War through this same strategic lens. Let me know in the comments. Which aspect of Barbarossa surprised you most? The logistics, the ideology, or the Soviet response? And what other operations would you like to see analyzed at this level of detail? Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next deep dive.